Today we're going to be talking about unpacking the FDA's new proposal for laboratory developed tests. I think we have a treat for you where we have a really great speaker coming in to talk about this topic. I know this is something that's on the top of everybody's mind, so we're going to be speaking with Gail Javitt, who's a director over at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. Gail provides strategic FDA regulatory advice for leading medical device, diagnostic, pharmaceutical, biological products, human cellular, tissue-based products throughout the product lifecycle and has successfully resolved disputes at the pre- and post-market stage. She has significant experience advising clinical labs on FDA and CLIA requirements for lab-developed tests, LDTs. And Ms. Javitt's experience prior to joining Hyman Phelps McNamara includes serving as a partner in a leading Washington, D.C. health law practice and as a law and policy director at the Genetics and Public Policy Center, part of the Johns Hopkins University. At that center, she was responsible for developing policy options to guide the development and use of reproductive and other genetic technologies. So someone amply qualified to talk on this topic, someone that's spent a lot of her career following this, because this has been a long unfolding drama with the FDA, so nothing new. And if you've been in the lab industry for a little while, you've probably followed it yourself, and it pops up every couple of years. This time seems to be pretty serious, maybe one of the more serious moves by the FDA that we've seen. So we're going to go through what that means, try to answer some questions at the end for you guys, but just really unpack what's in the release that the FDA has made public. Prior to getting into that, a few housekeeping items. To reduce your chance of buffering, please close any heavy bandwidth apps or programs you might have running in the background if you're experiencing buffering. To answer the number one question we get, and will, I'm sure, get still throughout the course of this webinar, is yes, the webinar will be recorded. Yes, you'll get access to it. You don't have to do anything. We will send you a link with an email with a link to the recording, so you'll be able to access this. And all of our webinars live online on our website under the resources tab, as well as on the Lighthouse Lab Services YouTube channel. You do not need to wait till the end to ask questions. If you have questions, if you look to your right on the panel, you'll see a Q&A section, which you'll be able to ask questions there. We'll be curating those questions, kind of grouping them to like other questions, and then we'll be trying our best to answer some of those at the end. If questions are really specific to your experience, your laboratory, it might be something that we're going to encourage you to jump offline and speak to Hyman Phelps directly about. And then there's some questions that you can't answer without a crystal ball. Maybe we'll give some thoughts on it, but we're not going to be able to give definitive answers on things that the industry does not have definitive answers to. We will also be running polls during the webinar, so we'd encourage you to participate in those. That helps us to hear from you so we know what you're experiencing, and that informs us as we go through this webinar to make sure that we're presenting information that's valuable to you. A little bit of Lighthouse, real quick pitch just on who we are in case you need any of our services. We do this as free. We're only able to do that if we survive as a company. And so what Lighthouse does, we provide medical laboratory directors to CLIA laboratories, provide staff with the largest medical laboratory recruiting firm. If you're having a hard time finding staff, we do have staff that we can provide to you, and we'd love to speak to you about that. We build labs from the ground up. We're working on about 8 a month that we're going live with. So if you're ever looking to get into the lab business, it's probably not on this call if you're not already in it, but are at a new line of testing, validated an LDT, those are all things that we do. Have our own LAS system, and then we have a revenue cycle management consulting group, as well as a payer strategy solutions group that helps laboratories to get in-network status with difficult payers. So if we can be of assistance with any of those things, please reach out and let us know. But today we're here to just talk about this industry topic, the FDA's oversight of LDTs, what that means for you and your laboratory. And I'm going to turn over the microphone to Gail so she can tell you a little bit about her thoughts and maybe walk us through this proposal so we can make sense of it. So Gail, I'll give it to you.
Thank you so much, John. And good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're on the other coast. I really appreciate Lighthouse hosting this webinar and inviting me to speak about something, as John said, I've been thinking about for a number of years. This is serious. This is not a drill. But I hope the take-home message that you will have at the end of this webinar is that it's not a foregone conclusion either. And there's certainly things that we can all do to change the outcome. So here's what I hope to cover. Give you a brief history of FDA's relationship with LDTs, on again, off again relationship, now very much on. Walk through what FDA is proposing, what we know, what we don't know, potential implications, and then getting to that next steps, what we anticipate will happen next, and then what we can do in response. And I look forward to your questions at the end as well. So I don't need to tell anybody on this call how CLIA works, how clinical laboratories are regulated under CLIA, but the history of FDA's oversight of diagnostics, both in vitro diagnostics and LDTs, is one of two divergent pathways. FDA, as all labs know who purchase these products, regulates in vitro diagnostics. These are products that include instruments, collection devices, test systems, platforms, sequencers, reagents, etc., sold by third-party companies that are device manufacturers, traditional device manufacturers, and they're sold to clinical laboratories for them to use to perform testing on specimens. IVDs meet the definition of a medical device under the statute and also under an implementing regulation. They are subject to FDA's tiered regulatory system for oversight, class 1, 2, 3, from low risk to high risk. They are subject to what's called general controls, labeling, record keeping, registration and listing, a quality system, regulations. And higher risk devices also are subject to pre-market review by FDA. So there's a barrier to entry to market. FDA inspects IVD manufacturers, and the statute, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is FDA's governing statute, imposes penalties for noncompliance. So laboratory developed tests, meanwhile, we're talking about tests that laboratories develop rather than purchasing a freestanding kit. Laboratories create them using their own protocol, develop them, validate them, and perform them within their laboratories. The protocol is not sold. Rather, what the service that is offered is ultimately a test report with information that is derived from the performance of that test protocol. CLIA governs the conduct of clinical laboratories, both personnel, record keeping. Sorry. Jumped ahead there. And a variety of processes and procedures that are intended to ensure that labs provide testing that is accurate, reliable, and timely. There's a certification process. There's also periodic inspection, and certification can be revoked for non-compliance by laboratories. So how did we get to where we are today? FDA historically has taken the position that while LDTs and laboratories are outside the scope of its medical device authorities, FDA could or can regulate them. But FDA articulated a policy of quote unquote enforcement discretion, meaning we can, but we won't regulate laboratories, in recognition that laboratories were providing a valuable service, and overregulation was not a good idea. There certainly have been periodic ad hoc departures from this enforcement discretion policy when FDA felt that a certain type of test or a certain specific test was posing risk to consumers. There have been cancer screening tests that have received warning letters over the years. FDA has particularly raised concern about direct-to-consumer genetic testing over the years. And there also have been periodic proposals by FDA for regulatory framework, but these have really been episodic, waxing and waning over time. things really came to a head around COVID-19 when the pandemic began. FDA declined to exercise enforcement discretion for COVID-19 laboratory developed tests and said laboratories need to get an emergency use authorization just as traditional IVDs would need to. And, as we all saw, there was a lag in time before tests became available as a result. There was a food fight between the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees FDA, and FDA's leadership over that decision. And so for a while, FDA's ability to issue EUAs for LDTs was halted. Ultimately, that was overridden. Not going to go through this whole timeline. It could take us a whole hour to do so, but really the take-home point is much has happened in the last almost 30 years, but very little has changed. The first time that FDA's authority over LDTs was challenged was all the way back in 1992 by my colleague Jeff Gibbs, and FDA, of course, said, yes, we do have authority. There have been a series of guidance documents, but those have never come to anything. Periodic warning letters, and then, as I said, COVID. And then you see at the bottom, you are here. On the congressional side, it's also worth noting, Congress has periodically introduced legislation addressing FDA's authority over LDTs, and for the most part, proposing that FDA have authority, but under a new framework. It may look a lot like the current device framework, but something that is specific for LDTs and tailored to LDTs. With one exception, there's one statute that actually said FDA would have said FDA stay out of LDTs and let CLIA be the sole governing structure for LDTs. Short story, none of them has been enacted. Last year, there was a lot of hope by FDA and those who supported the VALID Act that it would actually be enacted. It was added to an omnibus spending bill. Ultimately, it was stripped out. And it has been reintroduced in 2023, but nobody really thinks there's a whole lot of prospects for it being enacted. Okay, so let's turn to what this proposed rule is all about, what FDA is actually proposing to do. In short, FDA is phasing out enforcement discretion. So no more enforcement discretion for LDTs. FDA will apply the same enforcement approach as IVDs, under which laboratories will be considered manufacturers of medical devices, and LDTs will be formally IVDs. FDA's position is that the definition under the statute, the definition of device, encompasses test systems regardless of where or by whom they are manufactured. There's little distinction between test systems manufactured by laboratories and other manufacturers. And IVD and LDT test systems look the same, function the same, regardless of who is the manufacturer, so that there is nothing inherent in the nature or design of laboratory developed test systems that would justify excluding them from FDA's jurisdiction. FDA proposes to phase in its requirements for clinical laboratories over 4 years, and this would begin 60 days after a final rule was published in the Federal Register, whenever that would be. So in the first year, the requirements would be elements of what are called general controls for medical devices. And those are medical device reporting, also referred to as adverse event reporting, and corrections and removals. In the traditional medical device context, if you find that in the field that a device is not working, you can either replace it or take it out of where its environment. That's called correction and removal. Sometimes it also becomes a recall. So those two requirements would be applied to clinical laboratories. In the second year, all clinical laboratories would be required to register with FDA and list the tests that they offer. And FDA's investigational device exemption requirements would begin to apply to clinical trials involving LDTs. In the third year, laboratories would be expected to meet the quality system regulation. This is the device term for good manufacturing practices that manufacturers need to meet, and there are a number of components of quality system. And then finally, beginning in year 3.5 and 4, the pre-market submissions would begin. So for high risk LDTs, that would mean the submission of a pre-market approval application. For moderate risk LDTs, that would mean either a 510K pre-market notification or a de novo request for classification. So by the end of year 4 of the phase-in, under this proposal, all LDTs would be subject to regulation as IVDs. So there are many, despite the heft of this proposed rule, I think something like 60 pages, there are many questions that we don't know the answers to based on what FDA has proposed. Big one is, what about CLIA? Well, CLIA will continue to apply. There's nothing in this proposed rule that changes CLIA, nor could there be, because FDA is not the agency under the Department of Health and Human Services that implements CLIA. That's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So laboratories will continue to be subject to CLIA in addition to whatever FDA is proposing here. There's a reference in the proposed rule to maybe some enforcement discretion for laboratories that are under New York State's additional requirements. It's a little murky whether that would be an exception to all of which specific and New York State requirements would need to be met in order for that discretion to be applied. Another big question is medical device reporting. So what does an adverse event look like in the context of a laboratory test? With devices, not only are reports required if a patient is actually injured, but reports are required if there is a quote unquote malfunction, which is defined in the regulations, that could have caused injury and could cause injury if it were to recur. So what is considered a malfunction in the context of a laboratory test? Anytime that there's a null result, whether or not it was reported out. So laboratories may spend substantial time having to assess whether events are reportable. And the FDA's economic assessment, which I'll talk about in a moment, doesn't include any consideration of the time or cost that compliance with MDR would require. And then going back to GMP or the quality system, how will this translate? Because even FDA acknowledges that laboratories, there are differences between laboratories and traditional device manufacturers, and the QSR is tailored to traditional device manufacturing in terms of qualification of suppliers, design history files. There's no guidance in the proposed rule about how in practice a laboratory would comply with Part 820, which is where the QSR regulations are codified. Then turning to the pre-market requirements, the pre-market submission requirements. There's an underlying assumption that most of these submissions will be 510K pre-market notification in practice, which is a lighter touch pre-market review requirement than either de novo or pre-market approval. But the standard for 510K is that there be a quote unquote predicate device. So if you're a traditional device manufacturer, you say, I am similar to this previous device, and here's how I show I'm similar. But if there is no predicate, there can be no 510K. And there are many, many LDTs out there today for which there is no IVD. And that's part of the advantage of LDTs is that, there's more rapid innovation and many more types of tests than can be purchased through an IVD. If there's no predicate, what does that mean for LDTs? It may mean many more de novos, which have additional time and expense associated with them. So another big question is, why is FDA proposing this rule? So FDA believes and asserts that this is necessary to protect the public health by assuring safety and effectiveness of laboratory developed tests. And FDA has said that the current regulatory environment of enforcement discretion poses significant risk to patients. The commissioner of FDA, Robert Califf, said that the current environment where FDA does not assure the safety and effectiveness of LDTs represents one of the most significant gaps in the U.S. healthcare system today, and it puts U.S. patients at risk. FDA notes that these risks are much greater than they were when FDA first started regulating medical devices. And this is because LDTs now rely on high-tech and complex instrumentation and software and generate results and clinical interpretations. And FDA notes that LDTs are much, much more important and integral to the healthcare system today, which I think we all agree with. We just don't think this is the right answer. But given how important LDTs are to informing healthcare decision-making and treatment of patients, FDA feels it needs to intercede to make sure that it has reviewed or at least imposed its basic controls on laboratories performing LDTs. So certainly there are areas of this proposed rule that are open to challenge. And I think those generally can be bucketed in three buckets. Challenges based on FDA's assertion of fact, challenges based on their legal analysis, and challenges arising from the policy implications of what FDA is proposing. So let me briefly touch on some of those. This is not at all intended to be comprehensive. There are more arguments that I'm going to be presenting, but I wanted to give you a flavor of some of the key ones. So one of the most significant vulnerabilities and areas for potential challenge of this proposed rule are its factual assertions and assumptions, and in particular, its economic assumptions. There's a requirement that federal agencies prepare an economic impact analysis when they are proposing new rules to justify the cost of those rules, and that the costs outweigh that the benefits outweigh whatever costs of those rules may impose. And there are certainly reasons to question, and I am no economist, but there are economists out there analyzing this who have started to do so. There's certainly reasons to question FDA's economic analysis and the assumptions that it has made about the costs that this proposed rule will impose on labs. Certainly, it appears to underestimate the costs to labs of coming into compliance with these requirements. And a fundamental flaw is the analysis assigns zero benefit to LDTs, and it therefore omits consideration of the cost of reducing patients' access. Also, FDA really admits it doesn't know how many labs are out there and how many LDTs are out there today. It's hard to do an accurate economic analysis when you're missing that denominator. FDA cites as a potential benefit of the proposed rule the averted health losses due to problematic LDTs, but admits that some of this is based on supposition rather than data. But FDA certainly has strong opinions about this with limited data. So what about scientific facts that FDA asserts in this proposed rule? This also potentially could provide a basis for a challenge. FDA gives certain examples in the proposed rule, citing a dozen or so publications. Some of these really amount to anecdote rather than well-designed clinical studies, and which is a little bit ironic for a science-based agency that prides itself on being driven by the science. As we all know, anecdote does not equal evidence. And the FDA relies heavily on two studies, but one has essentially been retracted by its authors. It was reported to show that the performance of a certain molecular oncology test was not, had flaws. But when the authors reanalyzed the data, they changed their initial conclusion, and they, in their reanalysis and their publication of those data, concluded that the results from their specific study, which is cited in very small print on the bottom of the slide, are not generalizable to all molecular oncology testing and should not be used to change policy affecting all molecular oncology testing. There's also, in addition to questionable facts, there's omission of important facts. As I mentioned earlier, FDA does not ascribe benefits to LDTs, so everything is weighted towards risk. There's also no acknowledgement of the risks of in vitro diagnostics that have gone through FDA. There's an acknowledgement that no test is perfect 100% of the time, but there appears to be a double standard for LDTs in there, that there's a zero tolerance for LDT related errors. So finally, turning to the third bucket of potential challenges, these fall under both substantive challenges to the proposed rule and procedural challenges. So an example of a substantive challenge would be that the statute doesn't give FDA authority over LDTs because the medical device definition under the statute does not contemplate LDTs. FDA's approach to this appears to be that if Congress had wanted to exclude LDTs, it would have said so. I think the counter argument to that is that Congress knows how to say what it's going to regulate, and in fact is responsible for being clear about what it intends an agency to regulate. So the fact that Congress did not include LDTs affirmatively in the definition is evidence that Congress did not intend this. Interestingly, although FDA characterizes LDTs as test systems, this is not a word that appears in the statute. It's a word that FDA included in regulation implementing its statute. There's also arguments based on the lack of interstate commerce, the lack of commercial distribution. And there's also the point that Congress, as I showed in an earlier slide, has thought about this quite a bit and has tried many times to introduce legislation giving FDA explicit authority over LDTs without success. If Congress thought FDA had the authority, it wouldn't need to do that, arguably. Then turning to procedural types of challenges, administrative agencies are subject to the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs how administrative agencies conduct themselves, and in particular, how they propose and implement new regulations. And this is because administrative agencies aren't elected. Congress folk are elected to make laws. The agencies are just implementing them. And a foundational element of the APA is that agencies cannot act in a way that is arbitrary and capricious. And there's case law that interprets what activities can be arbitrary and capricious. Certainly an insufficient process to create a new rule would be an example of that, such as failure to perform adequate substantiation of the costs and benefits. And then in addition, if an agency, after comments are filed, does not adequately consider them and respond to them, this itself can be the basis for procedural challenge under the APA. So once the proposed rule is finalized, it will be important to review it to see to the extent to which FDA has responded and considered the many, many comments that will be submitted. Finally, turning to our policy bucket, really this boils down to the fact that the proposal is bad for patients. Everything else is commentary on that essential policy argument. LDTs, and I know I don't have to sell anybody on this call, provide a critical pathway for innovation and access. Most LDTs are not available as IVDs. Requiring FDA review will exponentially increase the cost as well as the time to bring such tests forward. Many labs will not be able to continue doing so. If they do, the pathway to market will be much slower, and patients will foreseeably suffer from the absence of tests, the tests that are no longer available or whose availability is delayed. The LDT pathway also strengthens the healthcare system by enabling rapid response to emergent threats. And we saw this very starkly with COVID-19. It really should be an object lesson. There was significant delay in test availability because FDA required laboratories to submit EUAs. FDA regulation will similarly reduce resiliency of the healthcare system to respond to emergent threats, whether those are infectious disease created or otherwise. Then there's the issue of resources. FDA admits it doesn't know how many labs are out there and how many LDTs are, well, how many LDTs are out there today. But foreseeably, FDA will be facing an onslaught of thousands of submissions in year 4 if the implementation phase goes according to plan. Certainly today, FDA does not have the resources and acknowledges as much that to the personnel that will be required to review these. And we got just a taste of how the system can grind to a halt with LDTs and IVD EUAs, where FDA's attention was diverted for many months, if not more, to review of EUA submissions, and all other types of devices had to wait. FDA at one point, at least in the Office of in vitro diagnostics, stopped offering pre-submission meetings with sponsors of devices because it just didn't have the personnel to do it. Finally, the proposed rule asks a number of questions and wants feedback from stakeholders about whether some LDTs should be eligible for enforcement discretion, and if so, why, what the basis for enforcement discretion would be, whether there will be unintended consequences of getting rid of enforcement discretion for specific patient populations, and if so, what mitigation steps may be available, whether there's a public health rationale for a longer phase-out period for small labs, and FDA gives us an example of a small lab, one with annual receipts of less than $150,000, whether there should be a carve-out for academic medical centers, treating them differently from commercial laboratories, and how programs such as New York State's CLEP program or the VA, the Veterans Health Administration, might be leveraged. So the key takeaway I have from all these questions is that FDA hasn't completely thought through some really important issues. and the implications of its proposal. It feels almost like they're still building the plane while seeking to fly it, to borrow a metaphor. And as a practical matter, FDA is going to presumably receive a lot of feedback on these questions, and if it modifies its proposed rule significantly, and then issues it as a final rule without opportunity, there will be no opportunity for stakeholders to see the revisions, which itself may be a procedural flaw. Okay, so turning to what happens next. Well, I wish I don't have a crystal ball. I certainly wish I did. But we do know that comments are due to FDA by December 4th. And this is despite the fact that several stakeholders, several entities have asked FDA to give a longer comment period, and FDA has said no. So we believe, based on this and other factors, that FDA is committed to issuing a final rule soon. It's very unusual for FDA, one, to give such a short comment period for a rule with such significant ramifications, and also for FDA not to grant an extension when stakeholders say they desperately need it in order to meaningfully and fully comment. So we read from that FDA is determined to issue this proposed rule as final soon, and that may be motivated by the fact that November 2024 has an election in it, and things could change within the agency. So we would not at all be surprised to see a final rule come out before that time. However, that said, a final rule is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a next phase. And so we do not believe that FDA regulation of LDTs is inevitable by any means. And it is really important, therefore, to create a robust record through the comment process, because that will increase the burden on FDA to justify its proposal. We do believe that if and when a proposed rule comes out as final, a lawsuit is likely. There are many parties that would have legal standing to sue FDA because of the adverse impact of the rule. And that's not just laboratories, that could be patient groups, that could be physician and hospitals. So we think it is likely there will be at least one lawsuit challenging this rule. And for the reasons noted and others I haven't had a chance to mention, we think that the final rule will be vulnerable to a variety of legal challenges. It's the job of a court to independently assess the factual and legal bases for FDA's actions. So a court would look at the statutory basis for jurisdiction, the accuracy and completeness of the economic analysis, and I star that one because I do think that is a significant vulnerability. The accuracy of factual assertions about risks to patients, the omission of material information, and, as I mentioned earlier, the adequacy of FDA's response to public comments. So the more comments, and in particular, the more issues raised in those comments, the more work FDA needs to do to appropriately respond to those comments. Now, just to clarify, FDA doesn't respond on a individual comment by comment basis, but really on a issue by issue basis. So every substantive issue or concern that is raised needs to be considered by FDA and either used to modify the proposal in some way, or FDA has to explain why it is not accepting the critique or the request for change. Another really important point and why it matters so much what we do now is that courts are limited to the factual record created during the rulemaking process. So if a comment and concern is not raised during rulemaking, it could prevent a court from considering it later. Courts have the discretion to stay the implementation of a final rule while it is being reviewed and goes through the court process. They do not have to do that, but we would expect that any plaintiff that would file a suit would ask a court to do that, because once the implementation process proceeds, there will be costs and potential harm that can't be undone. It will be much harder to walk back. So summing up, and then I see that there's lots of questions. I'm looking forward to seeing them, hearing them. This is really a time for action. And the key thing that you and all stakeholders affected by this rule can do is to submit comments. Individual comments individual comments, whether from an individual person or an organization, can be submitted electronically to FDA's docket. We hope some of you will be interested in joining HPM's coalition. So Hyman, Phelps, McNamara is preparing comments to rebut FDA's inaccurate economic, scientific, and public health assertions and to challenge the legal basis for FDA oversight of LDTs. It's something we've done in the past many times, and are putting significant resources towards doing that in this case. By joining in this as a member of the coalition, you will have the opportunity to inform the process without identifying yourself to FDA if you prefer not to, because we will be filing this on HPM letterhead on behalf of a group of stakeholders. And we hope we'll be able to say dozens of stakeholders, hundreds of stakeholders, to make it clear to FDA the magnitude of concern. It will also allow you to contribute your facts and experiences, which are really important for the economic impact and for providing real-world data on the benefits of LDTs to a wide range of patient populations that we may not be aware of, as well as foreseeable harm. So we want to be able to incorporate real-world evidence of the impact of this into our comments. And additionally, we will share with you our draft and hope that you will give us feedback on it if you are a member of the coalition. And joining will allow you to support the work that we are doing. And we will bill members on a pro rata basis based on the amount of work it takes us after comments have been submitted. So with that, I really appreciate Lighthouse again for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for all of you for logging on and listening today. And I will turn this back to John to moderate some comments.
Yes, thank you, Gail. Lots of really good information there, guys. Just reiterating that last slide, this is what we can do and actionable. I hear a lot of frustration and anger, even in the chat and the lab owners I'm speaking with every day about this, and I completely understand that. That alone is not going to bring about change. So we're giving you a couple really tangible paths towards taking your fate into your own hands a little bit here and potentially affecting what the future might look like. The no-brainer, low-hanging fruit for this is to file some comments, right? So 78% of you guys polled today, of the 500 or so labs that were live on the call, 78% of you said that this is negatively going to impact your business. Only 14% have filed comment with FDA. So I think we need to get that number up. As Gail mentioned, the FDA is required to respond to those comments. And just a little bit of clarity, and Gail, feel free to pile on if there's any additional clarity from your side, but the more specific those comments are, the more data-driven that they are, the more effective they're going to be, right? Just filing an FDA comment saying, this sucks, this is going to destroy my business, I hate bureaucracy, doesn't bring about a lot of change. That's pretty easy for the FDA to ignore or move past. But if you bring up, the cost of this, the test that you currently provide that's no longer going to be available, patients are going to be harmed, things that are very specific and as much data as you can put behind that, that's going to require the FDA to respond to that in a thoughtful manner. And that's going to take resources on their side and hopefully make them think about it. So I would encourage you to really think about filing those comments. and we can provide, I think we have even a pathway to that that we can push out to you guys so that you have a way to do that. The second option is, you know, even more strong. So instead of just commenting, it's let's go ahead and fund some resistance efforts. HPM has put together a coalition to do that. That takes resources. The more people we get into the pool, the more groups we have working together, the more effective we're going to be and the more efficient. If each of you guys were to go try to fight this on your own, it's going to be very expensive. There's going to be duplicative efforts, and it's just not going to be as effective as pooling resources, in my opinion. The more, the better that are fighting it. But if you are a small lab and maybe you don't have the resources to fund a $100,000 legal battle against FDA, let's join together, lock arms on this. And I think if we can get, you know, a group together to give their personal story, as well as provide data to Hyman Phelps so that they can go ahead and go after this, that's going to be a really effective strategy. So I'd encourage you to reach out. That LDT coalition email that you see on there will get you in touch with Hyman Phelps's coalition for this LDT opposition. Those offers we pushed onto your screen, if you already clicked on that, we're going to provide that information to the Hyman Phelps coalition so they can follow up with you on next steps about it. But it does take some resources, and we're going to have to pony up a little bit. And the more people we get together, the less it's going to cost us each individually. And I just want to, you know, make that real, because you can either try to fund this and potentially stay in business to fight another day, or if we sit silently, I think that this goes through. And the cost of getting approval for some of these LDTs is an unknown, and that might be a good place to start. There was a lot of questions that I've seen and heard, Gail, about, well, what will it cost if this goes through, it gets approved? What is it going to cost me to get approval? And I think that's a very hard answer, or question to answer. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. And it's, you know, it's a wide range, but easily a simple 510K could be $50,000 to $100,000. PMA could be in excess of $1 million. You know, anytime you have to do a clinical study, you're talking potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, de novos are probably somewhere between them, and it's important to note on a per test basis. So every LDT that has to go through could potentially cost that much.
Right. Yeah. Just big numbers add up super quickly, and just devastating to think about the impact for small labs on that. So again, it'd be easier and cheaper, I think, if we all try to fight this on this front end than having to deal with the results of this on the other side of it. So I encourage you to do that. Lots of other questions out there. Let's go ahead and jump over to a few of those. There seem to be several on the grandfathering piece, and this idea of when will this take effect, and what does that mean for me now, and will there be grandfathering of LDTs that are already currently clinically validated? Gail, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So when will this take effect? As you know, very shortly after a final rule issued, it will begin, and we'll begin with some of the general controls that I described. In terms of grandfathering, it's interesting. The VALID Act certainly had a provision for grandfathering, and FDA's proposal in 2014-2016 timeframe had a grandfathering proposal for things already on the market. There is no grandfathering in this proposal. It's, you know, one of the questions FDA has that it wants feedback on is, should enforcement discretion continue for certain types of tests? And, you know, potentially that could be with those that are certainly on the market, but a priori, there is no grandfathering.
Yeah. Okay, and then I guess some of the other questions were around, maybe will there be a tiering or assessment of risk, and what do we know about how LDTs will be assessed to determine whether they're low, moderate, high risk, and does that matter?
Oh, it matters quite a bit. I think we don't know directly, but we can surmise based on how FDA regulates in vitro diagnostics today. There's certainly some that are class 1 and exempt from pre-market review, but many of them are class 2 and require 510K. So to the extent that an LDT were similar to something that is offered as an IVD, I think looking to the analogous IVD classification and what's required for that would give some insight. The harder thing to predict is what about LDTs for which there is no IVD analog? One, because I mentioned earlier, there will be no predicate, and so the de novo pathway may have to be leveraged. And part of the de novo pathway is assigning a classification to the unclassified device.
Yeah, piggybacking on that, one of the strategies or some of the backroom chatter I hear from lab owners is if this was to take effect and it is to go through, we'll sit back, let LabCorp and Quest do the heavy lifting, or big reference labs that have deep pockets pay for getting these LDTs approved, and then we'll be able to have a lighter burden by pointing to their predicate tests, and it'll be significantly cheaper and less burdensome for us to file as kind of a second mover. Of course, you wouldn't be able to run your LDT during that period of time while the first one got approved, but do you want to respond to that strategy and whether that's a good idea, bad idea, and what the pros and cons might be?
Certainly it depends on the individual lab whether that's a good business strategy. As you said, one flaw or significant limitation of that is needing to stop offering the test until there is that predicate device to piggyback on. The other limitation of that approach is, one of the advantages of LDTs is there are many tests that are not necessarily commercially attractive to larger labs or to traditional IVD manufacturers. For specific populations, that address unmet need, rare disease, or even not rare but not super common diseases. So if bigger labs don't choose or are not offering those as part of their test menu, then there won't be something to piggyback on.
And will say a big reference lab does go through the process of getting one of these approved, will their information be completely open and public to be leveraged by groups following them to utilize that, or is there opportunity for them to sort of put it in a black box a bit, which would force other laboratories to do their own studies potentially?
I think that depends. So with a de novo application, what FDA does is they issue a new classification regulation, and they also create the quote unquote special controls that all subsequent manufacturers would need to meet. And one of those special controls sometimes is the requirement to do a clinical study. So if there's a special control included in a new classification regulation that says any future applicant, anybody offering this test has to have done a clinical study, then it would not be possible to even if the reference lab was interested in sharing that data, that would not be sufficient. Each lab would have to do, just as each IVD traditional device manufacturer would have to do its own test to satisfy that special control.
Right. Yep. Which sounds very expensive. Okay. And then, just sort of thinking this through, because I hear people in the chat talking about, potentially we can look to some of the instrument manufacturers for them getting some kits approved. I think, there may be kits approved, but if they're approved for collection or other things, it's not going to be helpful. Knowing who's on what side of this is sort of interesting. And I don't know, this is just John Harrell speaking, but from what I've observed, and I think if you if you pull back and look at who benefits from this, that the larger reference labs and the medical device manufacturers would probably benefit most if this was to go through, where any assay you buy is going to have gone through FDA approval. You're going to, of course, be running more tests that are sold to you by big manufacturers and run on platforms that are provided by them. And the ability for small, medium labs to fund some of these efforts is much different than a large reference lab. And so I think it's good for everybody to just kind of know who your friends are on this, because I don't know if it's always going to be the manufacturers of assays and instruments, because this is sort of bends in their favor, in my opinion. And then knowing the impact on certain industries. For myself, I'm really wondering how this could work for the toxicology drug testing space in particular, especially when we're testing for designer drugs. We've got an opioid crisis going on out there, and it's an always evolving market where new street drugs are showing up. And if we needed to wait for an FDA approved test each time to test for some of these street drugs, that seems like a really bad situation where it's going to go unregulated and untested for many years just due to the bureaucracy in the process. So trying to think through some of those things and what that could mean is a bit scary.
Yep.
But I think that, this is why we need to take action now.
Yeah, and John, you interesting points, and you would know the answer to this better than I certainly. But while on one hand, IVD companies may benefit, on the other, laboratories are their customers, and so if there are fewer laboratories to purchase the kits, which way, and the reagents and the instruments, which way does that cut in terms of impact on business? And similarly, I'm wondering to what extent big reference labs benefit from smaller labs developing initially LDTs, and then once they are, commercially successsul, adopting them. So it's a pipeline potentially that is no longer available. I don't know if that's true in fact, but just things I've been using about potential impacts.
For sure, yeah, it does seem like this would be bad for innovation. I think of all the liquid biopsy tests that are coming up as new startup companies that offer opportunity for early detection of cancers that are always LDTs, and thinking about us kind of throwing water on all that innovation that's happening is just sad to me. And I think it's bad for healthcare outcomes, it's bad for patients. And so that's an important thing for us to try to get across. But hopefully the big reference labs and the manufacturers of instruments and assays are also thinking about the fact that it might not be in their benefit. There might be some pros on the column, but if you are to take out a lot of small to medium-sized players, that could be bad for business too. Certainly bad for access to laboratory testing for the patient, and bad for innovation. So, yeah, I don't see a whole lot of good here. What do you think drove it? I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but who are the vocal supporters of this? Is it just coming from FDA? We saw Valid Act. I've always been surprised that we haven't been able to kill this. It keeps popping up. Not a lot of groups being super vocal, but I did hear from some that I was almost surprised by, patient advocacy groups, cancer advocacy groups that seem to be supporting this. Do you have any thoughts on that, Gail?
Yeah, I agree. I've seen that patient support, and it does lead to a point that I think is sort of being obliquely raised in some of the comments I want to address, where folks are saying, what about strengthening CLIA? The fact that we think that this proposed rule is a really bad idea for patients and public health doesn't mean that we, and I'm sure, and everybody on this call, supports safe and accurate tests for patients. I'm sure we can all point to tests that we think should not have been offered, or perhaps even shouldn't be on the market. So you can both support patient safety and oppose this rule, because as a court said in, I believe, 1992, FDA exaggerates its place in the universe. there are many other options for, to the extent you think the LDT framework system could be strengthened, many other options to explore for doing that other than the FDA pathway. And that could be strengthening CLIA, that could be expansion of CAP. Many, there's many other players with expertise here that we could consider. But I think in part because FDA has always pushed itself forward, some of those have not been explored as much as they could be.
Agreed. Well, we are at time, so I do want to go ahead and wrap up. I did want to also mention that if you had specific concerns that you need to speak with Hyman, Phelps, McNamara about, you can schedule an individual consultation. I just pushed to your screen an opportunity to respond to that. If you're interested in the coalition, please let them know as well, and that's a more appropriate place for general opposition to this versus engaging them specifically for your laboratory, but both are welcomed. Want to thank you, Gail, for your time. I know you're busy right now. There's a lot going on, and taking this time to walk us through it has been super helpful. So I really appreciate that. Thank you for everyone for attending. We will look forward to seeing you on next month's webinar. And again, we put these on for free. We're able to do that through using our services, providing services to labs. So if we can help you with recruiting or any other consulting efforts, please reach out and let us know. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, John. Bye-bye, everybody.